Okay, shifts in credit supply. So I've got two main reasons here that we're going to look at. And so, anything that shifts the credit supply curve is going to be something that changes the quantity of credit supplied or savings at each real interest rate or at any particular real interest rate. So one of those changes would be a change in the savings motives of households. So, really anything that could change, that could be over time. Perhaps households save more or less. That would shift credit supply to the right or to the left. Or demographic changes. So as the population gets older, you have a higher proportion of retirees or people nearing retirement. That's going to tend to shift credit supply to the right. And another reason, which kind of works opposite to what was going on with credit demand, is that as households become more pessimistic about the future, credit supply is actually going to increase. At each real interest rate, I want to save more or supply more credit. Why? Well, it's kind of related to that idea of the rainy fund that we talked about in the last video. So if I'm a little bit nervous about what might be coming in the future, so I'm worried potentially that I could lose my job, let's say, over the course of the next year, then I want to increase the amount I'm saving now to build up that precautionary savings or rainy day fund for the future. So when I'm pessimistic about the future, that's going to increase credit supply. And potentially, if I'm optimistic about the future, I may engage in less savings, and that would shift the credit supply curve to the left. So these shifts in credit supply, so the quantity and the real interest rate, so an increase or a shift to the right, we go in this direction, and a decrease or a shift to the left, we go in that direction. And that could come as a result of firm or households being more or less optimistic or pessimistic. Now, this also applies to firms who can also potentially supply savings or credit to the credit market. So firms earn profits. Right? This is the difference between the revenue that they earn, selling the goods and services they produce, minus their costs. That's my profits. Now, for firms, profits can really kind of go in two different directions. So if I earn a profit, what do I do with it? Well, I can take the profits and pay them to the owners of the firm. So that is called a dividend. So if you own stock in a company and that company pays dividends, you may receive a dividend every year. That's the company's profits that they've distributed to its owners or stockholders. So if I don't take my profits as a dividend to the owner, what else can I do with them? Well, I can put them in what we call retained earnings. Which is basically savings. And so depending on how optimistic firms are about the future, they may engage in more or less retained earnings, and it works very similar to what households are doing. So when firms become pessimistic about the future, so I'm not really sure what's going to happen, or I don't think the economy is going to be doing well over the next year, then firms are going to tend to increase their retained earnings. And so credit supply is going to increase or shift to the right. When firms are more optimistic, they're going to tend to keep less in retained earnings and send more out as dividends. That would shift the credit supply curve to the left or decrease. All right, so those are some basics of what can shift credit supply to the left and to the right. And so our next learning objective is simply to put these things together in equilibrium, which is pretty straightforward. We've done this in a bunch of different models thus far. So my credit market, I've got the quantity of credit on the horizontal axis, the real interest rate on the vertical axis. I've got credit supply determined by household and firm saving decisions, credit demand determined by household, firm, and government demand for credit or borrowing decisions. And where those two curves intersect is where we find equilibrium. So we have some equilibrium Q star, quantity of credit, and some equilibrium real interest rate, R, in the credit market. And so everything we've developed to this point is to understand what could change that equilibrium as a result of some event that affects the economy. So to get a handle on this, go through the question on Canvas. It's labeled, it's be right after this video, but it covers learning objectives 2 through 4, which is to understand what shifts credit demand, what shifts credit supply, and put those in equilibrium and see how that affects the equilibrium real interest rate. So give those a shot. The solution is also posted on Canvas.